You're listening to A Book with Legs, a podcast presented by Smead Capital Management. At Smead Capital Management, we advise investors who fear stock market failure. You can learn more at smeadcap.com or by calling your financial advisor.
Welcome to A Book with Legs podcast. I'm Cole Smead. I'm the president and a portfolio manager here at Smead Capital Management. At our firm, we are readers and book junkies. It can be said that leaders are readers, and we believe books provide us a great source of information for filtering what is and isn't important for us as investors. Investing is the last great liberal art and the best way to spend a lifetime of learning. This podcast is for readers, thinkers, business-minded people, and investors who want to grow their knowledge from great authors and their writing. Charlie Munger often talks about using multiple mental models and analysis. Our aim for this podcast is to help listeners test Munger's theory in business, markets, and people. I'm glad everyone has joined us for this episode of the podcast. We are going to look at bubbles through an excellent framework for studying these financial euphorias. We will also attempt to answer if bubbles are good or not. Joining us today is William Quinn and John Turner to discuss their book, Boom and Bust, A Global History of Financial Bubbles. Before they join me here to discuss, just a little background. William is a lecturer in finance at Queen's University of Belfast. His research is focused on historical stock markets, stock market bubbles, as we'll talk about today, and market corners. John Turner is a professor of finance and financial history at Queen's University Belfast. He is also the author of Banking in Crisis that was published in 2014. He is currently the editor of the Economic History Review. John was the Hublin Norman Fellow at the Bank of England in 2003 and the Alfred D. Chandler Fellow at the Harvard Business School in 2010. He is also a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. William and John, thank you for joining me today.
You're very welcome, Cole. It's lovely to be with you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for joining me. I kind of feel like, you guys are the first folks from Northern Ireland to join me, and that's quite a hot topic right now. So I think we'll make sure to press some hot topics in our discussion today too. So just to start it out, I have a sense of what you're going to say, but I'd love to have you explain to our listeners what inspired you guys to write this book and write it together.
So maybe if I could start on this one, and then Will can chip in, Cole. I've been interested in bubbles for 20 plus years now. I'm actually old enough to have taught an MBA class during the dot-com bust. And I remember arguing with my students who were all buying internet stocks, during 1999, that, I was saying to them, this is going to go, I've seen this before. I'm a financial historian. This is going to go wrong, guys. And they kept saying, no. They came back after the Easter break or the spring break, and they had lost a lot of money, and they came back to class with their tail between their legs. So it was really at that point that I got really interested in bubbles. And then over the years, I've had various PhD students work in bubbles, and I've worked with several of those over the years. And one of those, and I'm going to hand off to Will here, was Will.
Yeah, so my PhD was on the British bicycle mania, the most adorable bubble, as you put it. So I spent 3 years on that. And I was coming to the end, and John suggested writing a book about financial bubbles, a history of financial bubbles. And we thought there was really a gap for it because of the books out there about financial bubbles, the two that most people are familiar with are Charles Mackay, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, which is about 170 years old and is a lot of fun and very instructive, but also you could describe it as fictional. Most of what he says, or a lot of what he says, just isn't really true, even if it's true in the way that great fiction is true. It tells you a lot about the world and markets and how they work, but it's not a real history of financial bubbles. And also it's 150 years old. A lot of the most interesting bubbles have happened since. Mm-hmm. And the other one is Manias, Panics and Crashes, but by Charles Kindleberger. Mm-hmm. Another excellent book. But again, that's the first edition of that was 50 years old. And the amount of research, particularly quantitative, more scientific research that's taken place in those 50 years mean that we felt it really needed an update. We needed some kind of update on Kindleberger's history that ties all of this research together.
Well, and I think your book has a special place in that, because the other books that I think of too are obviously John Kenneth Galbraith's A Short History of Financial Euphoria would fall into kind of the psychology of that. And then I even think of like Ed Chancellor's book, Devil Takes the Hindmost, which is, kind of an amalgamation of storytelling in these bubbles. Let's just kind of jump in. So you can you push back on a major thesis that most people carry with them about bubbles in the investment community is what I'm speaking to. The opening of book, you point out that not all bubbles are economically destructive, and that some have positive social consequences. Teach our listeners a way that a bubble can be useful.
Okay, so I'll take this question. So the first thing you need to ask is, why are bubbles seen as a bad thing? Like, why do they cause problems? And when do they cause problems? The difference in fallout from a bubble varies very widely. So the reason people think of bubbles as bad thing is because they remember the housing crash of 2008. It's
Sure.
almost the defining economic event of our lifetimes, is the resulting financial crisis from that. And the problem there wasn't necessarily that there was a bubble, it was the exposure of financial institutions. So whenever the entire financial system is on the hook for a bubble, that's when they're going to start causing problems. If you look at other bubbles, and typically they're bubbles that aren't remembered so well, like the bicycle mania, where the financial system isn't so involved, the macroeconomic effects there just aren't anywhere near as severe. So straight away you're thinking, what are the effects here? And one of the effects then, once you've ruled out this large macroeconomic depression or recession, one of the effects is that you get lots of money flowing into particular companies, say irrational amounts of money flowing into particular companies. And what types of companies are these? Well, most recently, people would say it's electric vehicle companies. So to say that the electric vehicle bubble is a bad thing is to say that it's a problem that companies manufacturing electric vehicles are finding it really, really easy and really cheap to raise lots of money. And already from a social, environmental place, you can see, well, maybe that's not necessarily the case. And when we look back in history, we see the same thing. We see the dot-com bubble, where there's a short recession in the US lasting less than a year. But you find it very easy, if you're a technologically innovative company, you find it very easy to raise money. You go back to the bicycle mania, and a lot of those companies went on to become household names. They were, for their time, very innovative. Dunlop, for example, Dunlop Pneumatic Tyre, was one of the largest companies during the British bicycle mania, making the first modern pneumatic tyres. They found it very easy to raise a lot of money because there was a bubble. And that's why we would say, and it's not just our argument, others have made it, but we would argue that some of these bubbles are actually useful.
For us, we actually start with the metaphor of the bubble, and we think it's the wrong metaphor. And so we have gone with fire as the metaphor for the bubble, and we'll maybe get into this in our conversation about the bubble triangle, which equates to the fire triangle that we've come up with. But fire can be both destructive, okay, and as Will said, when bank leverage is involved, those types of bubbles tend to be very destructive. But fires can also sort of revitalize ecosystems. So some savannas, some ecosystems, fire actually is a key component of revitalizing those ecosystems. So it's useful. It's not always destructive, and so the same is true, we think, with bubbles.
Sure. Well, before we get to that, because that was actually, I had that coming up here, 2 questions out. But my next question I wanted to ask you, because you quickly talk about this at the beginning of your book, and I find it interesting because we always joke that price regulates price in investing. How do you define the price action that comes with a bubble? Because you guys have a little discussion on this early in your book.
So one of the issues with Kindleberger is that he doesn't really define a bubble as such. He says it's an upward movement of prices followed by a downward movement. So we seek to sort of parameterize that. Okay. And the way that we conceptualize a bubble is if there's 100% increase in the asset price followed by a 50% collapse over a period of 2 to 3 years, that for us looks like a bubble, and that's the criteria we used to for the bubbles that we actually include in the book.
Okay, and that's helpful, yeah, because like you said, a lot of this people tend to like to be vague when we're talking about bubbles versus, and I think your book does a great job of laying out a framework for this. So let's jump to your framework. Like you guys explained, you're looking at this as a fire chief or a fire inspector would in the aftermath of a fire. So can you explain the three sides to your bubble triangle and then kind of go through each for our listeners?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll take this question. So the bubble triangle, which is a central sort of explanatory framework that we have in the book, is akin to the fire triangle in chemistry. So from high school chemistry, people will remember you need three things for a fire. You need heat, you need oxygen, you need fuel. And you then need a spark to get the heat going and to set off the chemical reaction. So heat, oxygen, and fuel. And so in the bubble triangle, we say there's three necessary conditions for a bubble to happen. So first of all, the equivalent of the fuel, which is the money or credit. And so by this, we mean either very low interest rates. And so when you get low interest rates, you get investors reaching for yield. Walter Bagehot, who was a former editor of The Economist in the 19th century and a famous author, most famously he wrote Lombard Street, which is like a pamphlet for central bankers today. He said John Bull, which is a personification of the typical Englishman, can withstand many things, but he can't withstand 2%. In other words, as soon as interest rates hit 2%, the typical investors are reaching for yield. But there's also then this idea of being able to borrow to buy the bubble asset. And so that's also part of the fuel of the bubble. The next side of the bubble triangle then is the oxygen or the marketability. So this is the ease with which an asset can be bought and sold. And over the 300 years that we look at, there is a trend, and the trend is this, that things have become more marketable over time. So we have removed legal restrictions on the ability to buy and sell assets, particularly financial assets. We also have removed technological constraints. And so associated with all these bubbles that we observe, we see this sort of step change taking place in marketability. So we've had our money and credit, marketability. And the third side then is the speculation side. Now, speculation's always present in financial markets. But what happens in bubbles is you get a lot of amateur or novice speculators coming into the market. People who've never bought and sold financial assets or land or houses as investments before. And also, you might think professional investors could sort of bet against them and short the market. But what we observe in a lot of bubbles as well is that there's this inability to short the market. There's very difficult to short in these periods. So marketability, speculation, money and credit, and the spark that sets us all off, it differs. Okay, in some cases the spark comes from radical new technology, so that gets speculators excited. Or in most cases, actually, and what we find with these historical bubbles, it's politics, it's a political system, it's government policy that triggers the speculation. So that, in a nutshell, is the bubble triangle.
Sure. So let's start out by talking about the bubble of 1720, and I think this chapter you do an excellent job of really tying what was going on across Europe, on both sides of the channel. Can you explain to our listeners some of the precursors to the bubble of 1720 that was going on in the governments of the Western world?
Right, yes. So the 1720 bubble, this is really a political story. I would say the most political bubble. It's all about how these governments connected to each other. They were rivals at the time. This is the British, French, and Dutch governments. And they'd just been at war. It's known as the War of Spanish Succession, sparked by a succession crisis in the Spanish crown. And what was interesting about this war was that it was really the first time that the countries fighting the war were using these new state-of-the-art fundraising mechanisms where they're issuing large amounts of debt, which is to some extent tradable, in order to fund the war effort, and thereby taking on large amounts of debt. So when this war ends, it ends with various governments burdened with this large amount of government debt, and particularly Britain and France, who are rivals. They're worried about each other. And for them, high government debt was an existential threat. So if you have a lot of government debt and investors worry that you're not going to be able to pay it back, that makes it very expensive to raise money. And in particular, it makes it very expensive to raise money in order to pay for war. So if you're invaded and you suddenly need to raise an army, you're not able to do that. So years after this War of Spanish Succession, say 1715 to 1720, these countries are scrapping around, desperately trying to find a way to fix this debt problem. And what they eventually land upon, starting with the French government, is this large monetary scheme to convert debt into equity in a company which isn't technically a part of the government but has government support. And this was the Mississippi Company. Now, the way that this benefits the government is that the Mississippi Company pays them a reduced rate of interest on that debt, which makes it very difficult in theory to sell the shares of those companies or to convince investors to trade their debt for that equity, because it's a self-evidently bad deal, right? You've got this very high yielding government debt, yielding say 6 or 7% a year in some cases, and you're being asked to trade it for a company whose main asset is just the right to receive a lower rate of interest on that debt. How do you convince them to do that? And the guy they get in, John Law, comes up with this solution of creating the expectation of capital gains. So you're earning 7% a year on your debt, but if you swap it for shares in this company, maybe the shares in that company are going to rise 500% in the next 2 months. And that's just going to completely dwarf any kind of capital gains or any kind of profit that you would expected from just holding on to your debt. And this is why we call the chapter The Invention of the Bubble. This scheme was essentially creating a bubble deliberately to convince investors to part with their lucrative debt. And in France, the scheme blows completely, it just blows up. It becomes completely uncontrollable. It ends up taking over the entire French economy. And whenever it collapses, in order to fix it and regain credibility, they end up restoring their debt to the exact levels that it had been prior to the scheme. At the same time, Britain is looking at what's going on in France and considering it a threat, and they copy it with what we call the South Sea Bubble. This is controlled much more effectively, and as a result, they managed to execute an almost identical scheme successfully, which reduces their debt long term. And as we say in the book, this has been linked to the defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo, because that's how long this fundraising advantage lasts for.
Okay. Now, in the case of John Law, though, he came in and initially just wanted to set up effectively a central bank. So the auspices of what he arrived with wasn't crazy.
Right, yeah. A lot of what he did wasn't crazy. So his original proposal was for a general bank, which, as you said, just operated much like a central bank. It issued paper money, which I think may have been the first paper money issued in France. And certainly the idea of paper money was rejected after 1720 as a crazy John Law idea. But obviously from today's standpoint, we say it's just paper money. It's a pretty sensible monetary idea. To be clear, John Law is considered a genius. He's considered one of the great financial theorists of all time. But his immediate effect on France was the creation of this extremely destructive financial bubble. So,
yeah, and I also in your guys' writing, it seems like the coziness of that general bank with the Mississippi Company was where the problem was. In other words, it wasn't bad that someone was speculating; it was bad that the central bank and the speculation vehicle were de facto the same thing. They were it was robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Yeah, and John Law tried to peg the price of Mississippi shares to the paper money, which created this inflationary problem, which I saw some shades of in the Terra Luna collapse last week, where this peg, where, as you said, it's robbing Peter to pay Paul, it's clearly unsustainable, just leads to the devaluation of one thing or the other.
Well, and to follow on your idea of inflation, he assumed that he could just increase the money supply and it would bail the shares out in effect. I guess you mentioned Bagehot earlier, who obviously is really the modern father of the Bank of England. Using what we're looking at and talking about with Law, and let's just say using the framework of Bagehot as well, who said that the Bank of England should be the lender of last resort. The question is at what price. Do you think there's a serious policy question to be asked? Using say the Federal Reserve as an example, we were the lender of last resort in the spring of 20, and the question could be asked, but once again, at what price? Did we end up just bailing out assets, not dissimilar to what John Law was trying to do with his own company?
So thinking of this idea of the role of the central bank and acting as a lender of last resort. Bagehot's main plea to the Bank of England when he wrote Lombard Street in 1873 was, tell us up front that you're going to be a lender of last resort. Stop this sort of ambiguity about your role in the financial system. And even to this day, that ambiguity still exists. And I think central banks want that ambiguity because it deals with the moral hazard problem that arises, that banks take too much risk, investors take too much risk, and then expect the central bank to turn around and pump liquidity into the system and to bail them out. And so there is that sort of need within central banking, I think, to have that ambiguity. But one of the things that we explore in the book is this move towards the Greenspan put.
Sure.
The underwriting of financial markets. And that's where we're at today with central banks. And that creates all sorts of dangers for, creating bubbles in financial markets and in housing markets, because all of a sudden, if the central bank's going to come along and bail us out, then we take more risk.
Yeah, we had, I don't know if you guys have read a copy of The Rise of Carry by Tim and Jamie Lee and Kevin Coldiron. But they talk a lot about that. They call it a carry trade is what they call it. And it follows a sawtooth pattern, as they always do. So I completely agree on that. Now, what ended up happening to John Law in the end, as you guys write?
So John Law was sent into exile. He became so unpopular and so toxic that the French government had to sneak him out of the country.
Okay.
Where I'm not sure where he lived the rest of his life out. But yeah, he was used as a scapegoat, but perhaps not quite as effectively as the government would have liked.
Sure. And maybe that's a warning to anybody out there that we're watching as things unwind right now. Now, using England, like you point out, England very much looked at what France did and said, hey, if the French can do it, we can do it. And actually, as you guys point out, they did it better. There was a good social benefit to the government in the end.
Right, yeah. So their scheme, you could describe it as picking out the important parts of John Law's scheme. This was a proposal that was put to them by the South Sea Company. The basics of it were pretty much exactly the same. They were offering to take on the government's debt in exchange for equity and then receive a lower interest rate on that debt. The South Sea Company didn't really do anything important. It was a failed slave trading firm at that point, whereas the Mississippi Company actually performed a lot of important economic activity that it could point to and say, this is where we're going to make enough money to make up the difference. So it was, if anything, an even more obviously bad trade for the holders of British government debt. But they were also successfully able to create a bubble, just to engineer this rapidly increasing price that convinced almost all of the holders of this government debt to make the trade. And the important thing for the British government, I think, the conclusion we come to is that the key difference was that Britain was a democracy. And because Britain was a democracy, you could have a peaceful regime change in which the previous regime are used as a scapegoat. And that does two things. Firstly, if you have a scapegoat, there's less pressure to give people their money back, which is what happened in France. And this is something that we very noticeably didn't see after 2008. In early bubbles, whoever was responsible for causing investors to lose their money was often treated very harshly, very unfairly. After 2008, that doesn't happen at all. And what the advantage to the government was that having a scapegoat means you don't have to necessarily make people good again to some extent. That satisfies them. And the other difference is that it meant they could credibly commit not to repeating the scheme again, because this is why you don't just default on your debt, right? You know, if you go around defaulting on your debt or saying we'll give you lower interest payments on your debt, people aren't going to lend you money the next time. Because there's been a regime change, the British government can quite fairly say, that wasn't us, that was the last guys. And for that reason, people are still willing to lend to them. It doesn't damage their reputation. So I think this is a very rare success, managing to significantly reduce the payments you're making on your outstanding debt without increasing your cost of future borrowing. And that's why this is a bubble we look at and say that this was kind of a success.
Especially for the government. Or one way to think about it is the transfer of money from investors to the coffers of the British government. So using you guys start to comment on something in this, and it comes back in other discussions you have on bubbles, is the role of media. And we'll talk about this with the other two that we talk about. But what was the role of the media in the South Seas bubble in Britain?
So the media during the South Sea bubble, Britain did have a free press. So for France, the answer was fairly simple. The French government was controlling what was in the newspapers, and they wouldn't allow anyone to say anything bad about John Law's scheme. With the South Sea bubble, you have a very vibrant free press. You have competing newspapers like the London Journal, the Daily Courant, the London Gazette, which had been a monopoly but had previously expired. And they're all saying different things. You also have a lot of pamphlets going around. It's a very active environment of passing around pamphlets and reading and learning about the South Sea bubble that way. The problem was that no one really knew who to trust. So you look back on some of these pamphlets and some of them are excellent. So Lord Hutchison, who was an MP, just explained all of the reasons why this South Sea Company was offering a bad trade and the whole thing was going to go south. But you also have lots of other pamphlets floating about that, how would you say it? They sort of baffle the reader with bullshit. Mm-hmm. They're almost pretending to explain this complex debt-to-equity conversion scheme in a way that makes it look as positive as possible. And you're not quite sure whether these were people who really believed it, whether they're true believers, or whether they're simply, being paid by the promoters of the scheme, or they have some ulterior motive. So there's a lot of ambiguity, and essentially there's an information environment which, similar to today, is almost too rich. There's just too much information out there for investors at the time to, learn the truth.
Sure, and you guys take it further. You bring up Peter Garber, who argued that the South Seas bubble was. He says that in kind of an efficient market discussion, it was sane. In other words, what went on in price was actually, it made sense based on the potential prospects of the business. And you guys argued directly against that.
Right. So Peter Garber's argument is that essentially that the South Sea bubble had raised a very large amount of money and that it was reasonable for investors to believe that the company would put that money to good use. The company that's so good at raising this money and has all of this capital could potentially invest it in something useful. We point out that this becomes circular, right? It's a kind of circular argument that came up a lot during the dot-com bubble. People would say these internet companies have some great strengths. They're brilliant at raising capital. But if they're brilliant at raising capital, that implies that if you give them more capital, you're not necessarily getting a very good deal. So we felt this was unfalsifiable, not very well developed. There's not a lot of detail in what Garber writes. Garber is primarily focused on the tulip mania. So he provides a lot of detail on the tulips in the Netherlands. But with respect to the South Sea bubble, there's not a lot of detail on what types of projects would they have been looking at. If you're an investor today, you're not going to accept that. You're going to look deeper and say, okay, they've got all this money. What are they going to use it for? Are they capable of investing that in useful projects? There's no evidence at all that the South Sea bubble was even looking for these types of projects. So for that reason, we don't really buy it. We conclude that the South Sea bubble wasn't a good investment at its peak. It's not simply a crash that was unforeseeable. It's something that a fully informed investor would have fully expected to go wrong.
Using the current mania that we're ending, do you guys see any similarities between Garber's argument of that and I think the common pushback we hear is as we watch technology companies struggle, people will say, yeah, but look at how much money sits in the hands of venture capitalists. In other words, it's a fundraising or it's a funding shortfall tool for businesses. But does that not address, like you said, there's no underlying economic return in many of these cases to sustain?
Right. Yeah, that's how it's looked to me for a long time. That venture capitalists might simply be looking to cash out, looking to generate enough hype to take this to market and then cash out long before anything economically useful is produced, which is fine. If you look at the dot-com bubbles, the dot-com bubble, a lot of those companies take a long time to make a profit, but when they do, they make enough money to justify that initial investment. But certainly that argument that, first of all, that these companies are good at raising money, but also that, look, all of these really smart people are investing them. That's something that's come up again and again. And again, I think it's at best incomplete. If lots of very clever people are investing in something, that suggests that maybe you should have a look at it and look at how useful it is. But whenever the only argument you're hearing for something being useful is that lots of people are investing in it, lots of smart people are investing in it, and you don't hear anything convincing about how this company or asset is going to produce anything useful, that's a bit of a red flag that there's a free rider problem. Everyone is depending on everyone else to do the actual research.
I'm going to have to take you guys on the road with me because that just sounds too sensible. So you argue the consequences of the South Sea bubble in England was very little. Obviously, some investors were affected by it. There were some bankruptcies that you noted in London, but you talk about the disappearance of the joint stock company being really the biggest detrimental effect. Can you explain, what the joint stock company was, and then what came after that regime?
This goes back to the origins of where we get the word bubble, because the South Sea Company was wanting to convert all of this government debt into equity in the South Sea Company. They wanted to knock out the competition because on the market there were lots of what were called bubble companies setting up and taking capital away from the debt conversion scheme. And so the government wanted to put an end to that, so it passed something called the Bubble Act. And this Bubble Act essentially prevented limited liability companies setting up with tradable shares. And so all of a sudden, companies can't establish and float their shares on a stock market and have those shares traded. And this lasted, so the Bubble Act was dismantled in 1825, so it lasted for 100 years. And it set the development of the modern corporation back 100 years in the UK as well. But having said that, Britain went through the Industrial Revolution without, having, the joint stock company or the limited liability company in place. And it went through this enormous period of economic growth without these institutions. But yes, certainly one of the after effects of the South Sea bubble was a sort of regulatory clampdown on firms having, firms setting up as limited companies with tradable shares.
So let's pivot to the Australian land boom, because as you guys point out, they didn't have that kind of restrictions. They could have limited liability companies for this bubble, and like I said earlier, this reminds me the most of the subprime debacle that we had here in the United States. But there were some big distinctions to it. Teach us a little bit about this financial euphoria through your bubble triangle framework.
Yeah. So this property bubble, or land bubble that took place in Australia in the 1880s. We can think of Australia in the 1880s as an emerging economy today. That's how we would regard it. And the three sides of the bubble triangle were all at play in Australia. So we have historically low interest rates at that time. We have very easy credit. The Australian banking system in the 1880s was one of the most liberal banking systems we have ever seen anywhere and at any time on planet Earth. And so these banks were lending to property companies and to property developers who were building houses in large Australian cities, Melbourne, Adelaide, Sydney, for example. So there was also a real increase in marketability at this time. So marketability, first of all, in the land market, because what Australians did at this time was they created what was known as the quarter acre plot. And if you go to any large Australian city today, you'll see that Australians have this preference to live in the suburbs on their quarter acre plot. And this is because they all came from these really horrible cities in England and Scotland and Ireland, and they moved to this really beautiful location, and they all wanted their suburban plot. And so this is where the quarter acre plot was invented, and so land was parcelled up and could then easily be traded. And you get this standardization taking place within the land market. You also have, at this time, a whole bunch of property companies being set up in the stock exchange. And when I say stock exchange, I mean stock exchanges, plural. In Melbourne alone, in the 1880s, there were 6 stock exchanges trading the shares of these property companies. These property companies were speculating on land. They were also borrowing quite heavily. They were part banks, part property speculator, really bad combination. And so that's on the marketability side. And then in the speculation side, everyone who had any money was speculating in land. They were speculating in property. They were speculating in shares. And so, we document in the chapter just the frenzy that was taking place on the stock exchange and then in the land and the property markets in Australia. And this is all sparked by politicians, because politicians at this time, again, really bad combination. You don't want your politicians to be property developers and property speculators. They had a lot of skin in this game, and therefore they deregulated the banking system so the banking system could push more money towards the property market and the property development. And so just to give you an example of how much property prices increased. So take Melbourne, for example. The annual return in the 1880s on suburban land, these quarter acre plots, as an investment asset was 40% per annum in the 1880s.
Wow.
So a huge return was being generated. Land prices in Melbourne between 1882 and 1888 went up 10 times, so suburban land prices. After 1888, they collapse, they fall by 60-70%. House prices in Australia double in the 1880s, and then again collapse, and it's decades before they actually recover. And when this whole thing unwinds, which takes about 2 or 3 years, Australia in 1893 has the largest banking collapse we have ever seen in history. Half of the Australian banks, there's 28 banks at the time, 14 of them collapse. And that's about half, in terms of assets, that's about half of the Australian banking system time. So huge devastation. And the devastation that brings to the Australian economy, it causes a deeper recession than the Great Depression in the United States. It causes a longer recession than the Great Depression in the United States. This really hurts the Australian economy, and it's pretty much just before World War I, before the Australian economy has recovered from this property collapse.
Well, and I think you pointed out it really well in your book that part of the problem with the collapse was that this was all funded on other people's money, or really capital coming from the UK, which is really a distinct feature. In many respects, it reminds me of, say, like an Iceland or an Ireland prior to the 07 to 09 episode, where it was big foreign money flooding the banks, paying very high deposits.
Yeah, so put some sort of figures on this. In 1890, a quarter of the deposits from, or a quarter of the deposits in the Australian banking system were coming from the UK. Now, the cool thing about these deposits, and the reason why this thing took so long to unwind, is that these were usually term deposits of like 1 year, 2 years. But these Australian banks, and also then the property companies that were doing a lot of the development work, they were advertising in English and Scottish and Irish newspapers, trying to get depositors and trying to get money from the UK. And it's really only then when something happens in Argentina. So Barings Bank, a large investment bank in London, loses a lot of money in Argentina, comes to the Bank of England for assistance. And it's at that point in time people begin looking at other emerging markets, British investors, and they start looking at Australia and say, right, we're not sending any more money to Australia. And so the money flows all of a sudden stop. And that's when the whole banking system then implodes in Australia.
So the media was obviously making money off of advertising, like you pointed out, for these land development companies. Was there any criticism in the Australian publications of what was going on at all?
So most of the criticism was actually taking place back in the UK. And so, you read The Economist at the time, the London Times, they were pushing back against this. They were interviewing British bankers who had gone out to Australia for visits, and when they came back, and they were describing the scenes of frenzy that they saw. There was only really one journalist in Australia at the time who was pushing back against this, and this was a muckraker journalist. He was trying to catch out the politicians who were up to no good in the middle of all of this. But he was really the only person, and because he was a muckraker journalist, not a lot of attention was paid to him at the time of the property boom.
Well, you pointed out that the technical change that the banks got to get this going was they could lend on land, which obviously just creates more liquidity to the point of your bubble triangle. And then, you had I think you point out there were 2 interest rate cuts in 1887 from 6 to 5% in January of that year, and then again from 5 to 4%. I mean, just to fathom going from 6 to 4% on rates, I think would feel anything, wouldn't it?
Totally. Given so those rates may seem high to us today, living in a low interest rate environment, but that was a huge interest rate cut that was coordinated by the banks in Australia at the time. And, as you say, Cole, the big deal was that the politicians removed the one remaining piece of legislation that was holding these banks back, and that was the fact that they couldn't lend against land as a form of collateral. And as soon as they removed that, that's when this whole thing then begins to unwind. And, the system just goes crazy because there's so much money floating into the property sector.
Well, and you guys did a great job explaining that it was kind of the property development companies were really leverage squared. They were, they borrowed most of the money to buy the land, and then they would turn around and they would be providing leverage to the investors. Can you explain how they would sell that to the investors?
So the investors would come in and put down a small down payment. They then would borrow so the property company itself was part bank, part developer. And so these property companies were raising money from depositors in Australia, but also from depositors in the UK. And so, as I said, a really bad combination. So that was that. The property companies themselves were extremely highly leveraged because they were essentially being funded through this deposits coming from mainly from the UK, and also the the shareholders of these property companies, they were really attractive to shareholders because you only had to put down a small down payment on your shares. So let's say the share was $10, you only had to put in $1 to get your shares in the company. So you also had leverage there. So you had leverage cubed to some extent in this bubble.
Well, and you pointed out, I think that the commonality was the railway mania had the same thing where you didn't have to put up all the money. You just put a small, effectively a deposit on the price, which always creates, margin issues. The consequences of the Australian land boom, you talked about the price destruction in houses. What did it do to the banking system itself?
So in terms of the banking system, as I said, half of the banks collapsed. That's about half of the banking assets collapsed. So the state governments in Victoria and New South Wales had to implement a series of bank holidays, allow bank recapitalizations. It took the banking system a long time to get back to where it was and back to the lending channels had all been dissipated with these collapses. And so it takes a credit system in Australia 2 decades to actually recover from this, and of course it now means that these banks are now regulated after this collapse.
You guys pointed out that they also guaranteed 50% of the deposits in government notes, which had a government ever provided any kind of deposit insurance like that before?
Yeah. So this is something that had happened in other countries. But because this was so extreme and the collapse so large, this is the first time we ever see this sort of government intervention to this scale taking place.
Sure. And obviously they did it in government notes, which, not that I'm a conspiracy theorist, but if you pay out government notes, you can always print more. So it's always incentive structures. So let's pivot, and I think the last that we'll have time for is, and I apologize to Will, not knowing that his work was specialized on this, but I call it the most adorable bubble of all time, the British bicycle mania. It just sounds so cute, quaint, almost Dutch. You're just riding your bike along the fjord. Can you guys give us the background on what was going on at the time in Britain? And what your framework would teach our listeners and the readers of your book about this bubble.
Right, so the economic background is essentially that Britain was doing reasonably well. This was the 1890s was a very fertile environment for bubbles. You had historically low interest rates for the time. This is also around the same time or just after the Australian land boom is happening. So a lot of the factors that made it easy for Australian companies to raise money in Britain also applied for bicycle companies. You have much more liberal laws than you had in, say, 1720 or in the first half of the 19th century. And you also have very low share denominations for the first time. You have, well, not for the first time, because there had been, low denominated shares for a long time, but this was when they started to become the standard. Previously, you would have had a lot of companies with a share of £100, which ruled out pretty much all of the middle and working classes. With the British bicycle mania, you have £1 shares, which are much more affordable to a much wider range of society. So it's essentially a fertile investing environment, particularly by historical standards. This is when this long-term increase in marketability had moved quite a long way. What happens with bicycles is that there's this transformation from the types of bicycle that most people would think of when you imagine a 19th century bicycle. So your very large front wheel, very small back wheel, made entirely of metal, usually wrought iron, very uncomfortable to ride because there's no pneumatic tires, there's no real suspension. British roads aren't really a good match for this. There's plenty of potholes at the time, so it was very common for cyclists to flip over the handlebars and land on their head, and because the front wheel was so large, they had a long way to fall. So they're really quite dangerous. The most comfortable model, the most successful model, was nicknamed the Bone Shaker. Just gives you an idea of how impractical these machines actually were. And what happens in the 1890s is you get this pretty sudden transformation to the modern bicycle. The bicycle, which it becomes popular in 1896, looks pretty much exactly the same as a modern bicycle. The diamond frame is invented, so it looks the same as a modern bicycle. You have the pneumatic tire, and this causes their popularity to explode. So you see all of these qualitative reports of lots of people, particularly women, riding their bicycles around the streets of British cities for the first time. And what you see then at the same time is that there's this excitement around bicycle companies as an investment, because those which already existed have suddenly started to do really well. You had the pneumatic tire company, which later became the Dunlop company. They were established with a nominal capital of £300,000. And whenever this company takes off, they're bought out for £3 million. So if you had invested in that company in the space of just a few years, you've earned this 1,000% return. And this attracts all kinds of investment. And what we see, which I think is a common story in bubbles, is that prices essentially rise too much. The companies are good investments initially. They're making a lot of money, and the initial rise in prices is a correction. But this brings in all kinds of speculators. It brings the market itself to national attention. People start day trading, just buying and selling these very frequently, essentially as a hobby. And that's when the price starts to become, too high, to the point where these investments are going to go badly wrong.
When you point out this Hooley character that shows up with Dunlop, can you explain what he did in the transaction he pulled off?
Right, so Ernest Terror Hooley was a promoter. His job was to buy a company and then sell it, which is how he put it himself during his bankruptcy proceedings. How does this work? Well, the idea is that he's essentially taking it public. So he identifies a small bicycle firm, which maybe doesn't produce very many bicycles, but has a good name potentially, and he buys it, and he then floats it on the stock market. So in the meantime, he will have paid off lots of newspapers to run these pieces talking about how great an investment it is. They've got word out as far and wide as he possibly can. Just tried to attract as many people as he can to the company, and for a long time he succeeds. So he's buying companies like the pneumatic tire company. I say he bought that out for £3 million. He ends up floating it on the stock market for £5 million, which is, well, the Dunlop company is one of the companies which does well long term. Most of the companies he promotes don't. So that's his biggest achievement. That's his biggest one-off profit. But a lot of the other companies he promoted, he was making a much larger markup and generally giving investors a much worse deal.
And your writing kind of begs the question of when will the season for that business come where it has the most value? Because obviously Dunlop didn't end up in the bike business. It ended up in the car business. And I think you had a small note in there mentioning that investors had to take losses for quite a few years as that transformation took place.
Right, exactly. So I haven't worked it out exactly, but with all of the discounting, it may be that Dunlop wasn't a spectacular investment, even though it becomes this global company, because it takes a long time for them to really take off. They make pneumatic tires and develop this reputation for making very high quality pneumatic tires, but it really peaks much later whenever all of these pneumatic tires are required for motorcycles and cars. And this wasn't predictable at the time, obviously. All we knew was that all we would have known was that this company was finding it very easy to raise a lot of money, to the point where you would wonder, is this a good investment? But on a societal level, it was useful.
To your point of usefulness, can this be analogously looked at? I mean, we've always had food delivery in the Western world. We never had it at the ease of an iPhone app or a cell phone app. Do you kind of look at what we've seen recently? It's useful. It's used. Is it novel? In other words, is it going to take progress a lot further forward? We still ride bikes today, but what these technologies were actually used for were different in the end, and the economic consequences to get there were much stranger than we would have expected.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting comparison. I wonder, when I look at these companies, particularly a company like Uber, say, which is also branching into food delivery, which is losing a lot of money but providing a lot of service. And I wonder, is the end game here that this company goes bankrupt and its main effect was to provide subsidized travel for the whole world for a period of 15 years? You really don't know what the social effect is going to be. Which, I think what we're really trying to do with this useful argument is just shift the dial, because most people think of bubbles as just something negative. When if you take a holistic view, look at all of its effects, maybe that's not necessarily the case.
Well, I know if we called Domino's Pizza right now and said, hey, a bunch of people taught you how to use an app, has that made your business a lot better? We would know it has. I mean, there's no question. So in our lifetime, are we going to really look and say, gosh, Domino's got so much better during that bubble? I don't know. You guys explained that interest rates went lower from 1894 to 1896. I think it was 2%. Was this just kind of the classic watershed, kindling for this bubble?
This was a new record in the UK. This is the lowest interest rate the UK had ever experienced. And it was actually part of a wider phenomenon. There's something called the Great Depression, which economic historians think about as happening from the late 1870s into the 1890s, where the world economy is depressed and interest rates are low. And so really, we have these really low interest rates in the 1890s that feed into, as well as already said, the Australian episode, but particularly feed into the UK, because all of a sudden you get this reaching for yield where investors are not satisfied with the low yield that they're getting on government securities. They're reaching into riskier securities, and so bicycles come along, and this is a very attractive investment for investors reaching for yield.
We let's see. I'm trying to remind myself the order, but we've looked at long-term charts of interest rates in the late 19th century. They dove, and obviously we considered that the Gilded Age, right? Wealth grew while rates were low, which is not shocking. That's called interest rate theory. But I pointed out because Europeans were doing all kinds of stuff like trying to go to the North Pole, the South Pole, and the top of the world with like K2, for example. And isn't it kind of analogously interesting? We're trying to go to the moon while interest rates have been really low too. What would you say were the economic consequences? In other words, I think you tipped at this earlier, but what was the damage tied to the fallout from the bicycle mania?
So the damage is very localized. The bubble itself is fairly localized. Most of these companies are based in the West Midlands. And we see some evidence that West Midlands experiences a localized recession after the bicycle industry. The bicycle industry goes into a recession, which is unsurprising, but it doesn't show up at all in national figures or even outside of the West Midlands. It doesn't seem to make much of a dent. And I feel that the main reason for this, is simply that the banks aren't involved. The banks are very conspicuous about the fact that they're not involved. That this isn't long after the Barings failure, the original Barings failure. So people are quite conscious of the idea that banks can fail. And the banks repeatedly issuing statements saying, we don't hold very much bicycle stocks. We are not exposed to this.
Yeah, well, and just to give listeners a feel, we're only touching 3 of the periods that John and Will get at in their book and in their framework. The other ones they deal on are the first emerging markets bubble. They talk about the railway mania that we mentioned earlier, the 1920s, Japan in the 80s, the dot-com bubble. I thank you for actually saying something that I don't think most people below 45 actually know, which is that during your chapter on the subprime bubble, the central bank and the economists at the time, and even Wall Street, they thought we were beyond recessions in the future, which was an interesting argument being made at the time. And I guess I just really thank you guys for actually bringing up that people believed that garbage so much.
Yeah, so even the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK, who then went on to be Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, he was famous for saying, no more boom and bust, was how he was running the economy. And so we were all lulled in, so, the wider society, policymakers, central bankers were lulled into this new state that things were never going to have crises again. So yeah, that was, as you say, for people under 45, that's maybe a revelation.
Exactly, and very dangerous. We all know to cover our head and put our protective gear on when that happens. This has been a ton of fun, and I mean, if you guys are picking up on this, I could go on for hours with you guys, which I'll probably have to do over pint sometime. But is there anything from your book that we haven't talked about that you think needs to be mentioned, or any pieces of the discussion that we've missed?
I suppose, one of the things that we kind of wrestle with in the book is this idea of being able to predict bubbles, or being able to spot bubbles when you're in the middle of them. And, we point out, what's the role of the press in all of this. And really, you have to take what the press say with a pinch of salt, or what the news media says with a pinch of salt, and ask, what are their incentives? Mm-hmm. Have they incentives to engage in, actually be purveyors of truth, exposers of financial folly, or have they incentives to engage in venal journalism, or are they, do they rely so heavily on the advertising revenue that's come from, the bubble, that they're not going to call it? So that's something we kind of wrestle with. How do we know if you're in the middle of a bubble? And this is why we keep coming back to the bubble triangle to say, okay, are we in a bubble today? And we've been talking about this since the book came out over 18 months ago, and people are talking about crypto. And we've been applying the bubble triangle to crypto and trying to understand whether it has the same sort of force. And Will and I have had back and forth conversations with one another, and we've been saying that crypto is a bubble because it's got all the aspects of the bubble triangle were present.
Yeah, I think we use it more as a picture of what's going on in euphoric attitudes and speculation. In other words, I agree. You could probably look at it as a standalone bubble, but the question is it actually part of a broader, more complex story than that? And that's how we kind of look at that. The term that I often think about with bubbles, and I think Will came pretty close to saying this earlier, is the word Gestalt, which is obviously a German word, and it's where the organized whole, is perceived to be more than the sum of the parts, right? I think Will called it a circular argument, right? That's what I think typically, bubbles tend to exhibit is in the minds and the psychology of the people participating. It's far bigger than the actual numbers are. And I think of in today's, discussions, the word TAM, right? Well, what's the total addressable market? It could be 50 or 100 years away, but it just sounds so exciting. So I really appreciate both of your guys' time today. This has been, a lot of fun. John and William's book, Boom and Bust does a wonderful job of explaining that bubbles do not follow a simple pattern, but yet have a framework for understanding complexities to each of these episodes of Mania that we talked about. They teach you about some bubbles you may not be aware of from history that I think are insightful for investors. You need to go get this. We've always had a copy of Galbraith's book, A Short History of Financial Euphoria, here. I would put it right next to it. You need to get this book. We were blessed to have William and John write this and be with us today. For our listeners, if you have a great book that you'd like to recommend, email podcast@smeedcap.com. That's podcast@smeedcap.com. Thank you for joining us for A Book with Legs podcast. We look forward to the next episode.
Thank you for listening to A Book with Legs, a podcast brought to you by Smeed Capital Management. The material provided in this podcast is for informational use only and should not be construed as investment advice. You can learn more about Smeed Capital Management and its products at smeedcap.com or by calling your financial advisor.